All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving deep into a puzzle, an ancient one, hidden right in plain sight in two of the Bible's most foundational books. Seriously, this thing has stumped scholars for centuries. But what's cool is, new analysis suggests maybe, just maybe, we've all been asking the wrong question this whole time.
So let's jump right in. We're going to start by looking at what seems to be a flat-out contradiction in the law given to ancient Israel.
Okay, so check this out. On the one hand, you've got Exodus 20, which seems pretty clear, right? It says you can worship at altars in all the places where God's name is, plural, places. But then you flip over to Deuteronomy 12, and it seems to say the complete opposite. It commands sacrifices only at the place, singular, that God will choose. What gives?
So, this really raises a huge question, doesn't it? I mean, are these two laws just fighting each other? Did the rules change over time? Or, and this is the interesting part, is it possible we're not even understanding what the debate was really about? And listen, why this matters is huge. The answer completely changes how you see the text. Is it just a messy patchwork of rules that evolved, or is it a single coherent whole?
All right. For a really long time, one major theory dominated the scene. It offered a pretty straightforward, though at the time totally revolutionary, explanation for this whole mess.
This idea is often tied to a big-name scholar, Julius Wellhausen, and his argument was basically this: the laws just evolved over hundreds of years. The thinking goes that Israel's religion started out kind of primitive, with lots of local altars everywhere. That's your Exodus law. And then over time, it got more sophisticated and centralized into a system with just one main altar in Jerusalem. And that's what you see in Deuteronomy.
But what if the text itself tells a different story? Okay, let's really dig in here. Because if you look closer at the original Hebrew, and you think about the practical realities of life back then, a totally different picture starts to emerge. And it's one that might just solve the whole contradiction without needing to imagine hundreds of years of evolution.
So, the first big clues, they're actually hidden in the language. Specifically, in the original Hebrew words used in these passages. It turns out they're a lot more ambiguous than our simple English translations let on.
Take this phrase from Deuteronomy. It says, God will choose a place in one of your tribes. Now, in English, one of sounds, well, like one. Singular. Case closed, right? But in Hebrew, it's not that simple.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. The Hebrew phrase that we translate as one of is the exact same phrase used elsewhere that gets translated as any of. If you look at Deuteronomy 18, it talks about a Levite coming from any of your gates. Obviously, they didn't have just one gate. So this is a huge linguistic clue. It suggests that in one of your tribes could actually mean in any of your tribes, and that changes everything.
And this isn't just some weird one-off thing. No way. This pattern, where a singular word actually refers to a whole group, pops up in other places in the text.
I mean, take the story of the Korah rebellion. Moses says God will reveal the man whom he chooses. The word for man is singular. But what was the choice really about? It wasn't about one guy. It was between two groups. You had Moses and Aaron on one side and 250 rebels on the other. So that singular man clearly refers to the entire winning party, not just one person.
Okay, let's shift gears from language to logistics for a second. Let's look at the practical side of things, because this really builds the case. Just try to imagine what having only one single central altar would have meant for your average family back in ancient Israel.
We're talking about a distance of roughly 150 kilometers, or about 93 miles. That's how far it was from a city way up north, like Dan, all the way down to the sanctuary in Jerusalem.
So you gotta understand, this was not just a casual weekend trip. The law required the entire family to pack up and make this journey multiple times a year. And get this, it was often right during peak harvest time. For a ton of people, trying to obey a strict single-altar law would have been an absolute logistical and financial nightmare. It would have made regular worship basically impossible.
So, okay, when you put it all together, you take the flexible language, you add in the sheer practical impossibility of it all, a whole new interpretation starts to make sense. And this new view suggests the debate was never really about the number of altars, it was about something else entirely.
And that brings us to the real heart of this new analysis. Maybe the argument was never really about one altar versus many altars in the first place.
You see, the real conflict wasn't about how many altars there were. It was about who got to decide where they went. The law in Deuteronomy isn't saying no more altars. It's saying you can't just build an altar wherever you feel like it, like the Canaanites were doing.
The whole point was about divine choice, not about forcing everyone into one central location.
This quote from G.T. Manley just nails it. It's not the number of altars, but their character that's in question. The rules were all about making sure Israelite altars were special, set apart. They had to be built only where God said so and with uncut stone, to make sure their worship stayed pure and didn't get mixed up with all the pagan stuff happening on the high places. And on that point, both Exodus and Deuteronomy are in perfect agreement. Worship has to happen on God's terms in God's chosen places.
Now, this isn't just some small academic tweak to an old debate. No, this reinterpretation is actually part of a much bigger shift happening in biblical scholarship, a shift that's questioning some really long-held assumptions about how the Bible was even put together. And this is not happening in a vacuum. All across the field, scholars are taking a fresh look at those old theories from Wellhausen. They're looking at things like the structure of the text, the sequence of the laws, and this whole idea of centralization. And they're finding evidence that things are way more unified than we thought. This whole altar paradox we've been talking about, it's a huge piece of that bigger puzzle, and it's seriously challenging over a century of scholarly thinking.
So what does this all mean? Well, it just goes to show you that even texts that have been studied for thousands of years can still hold surprises, especially when we're willing to question old assumptions. It's a great reminder that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't come from finding a new answer, but from realizing we've been asking the wrong question the whole time.